So thank you for joining us for this brilliant lineup. And before we get started and I introduce to you our very experienced and international speakers, I just want to share some housekeeping rules with you. So firstly, this session is being recorded and will be available to view in the member section of the Big Tent website and may also be used for promotional purposes, so just be aware of that. And if you would like to watch a replay of tonight's event or any other Big Tent digital session, it is one of the exclusive benefits available to being a Big Tent friend and a student friend. So you can visit the Big Tent website for details. Now, I am a bit biased, but as an existing friend, I do highly recommend this. Also, a special thank you to our partners today, which are World Vision and Fin Partners. And following the speaker's opening remarks, I will be inviting you to ask questions. Some of them have been pre-submitted when you registered, but there's also the opportunity to ask questions in the chat, and I will invite you to ask your questions following throughout the discussion. Please stay muted unless you obviously have a question, and I will call you. And we expect this event to last an hour, but there is the opportunity to continue an informal discussion after, which will not be recorded. And Harriet and John have kindly agreed to stay on, although John might have some pressing matters to attend to. But you should be able to spend a bit of time with both of them afterwards. So please stay on this Zoom link to enjoy that. And if my internet collapses, another chair will step in and take over. So with us today, we've got the Honourable John Mckay Mp, who joins us from Canada, which I think is one of the silver linings of living life virtually. He is the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Defence, and also chair of the Canadian section of the Canada-United States Permanent Joint Board on Defence for the Government of Canada. Harriet Baldwin MP has held multiple ministerial posts, but most recently she was Minister for State at DFID and the FCO as Minister for Africa. So she will be able to provide an insight from both perspectives. And Amy Johnson is the Government Relations Manager for World Vision UK, with previous deployments to Jordan, Bangladesh and Uganda. And Nadine Haddad has provided us with a pre-recorded video because in her defence, she is based in Australia, so timings were impossible. My name is Laura Round, and I used to be a Special Advisor to the Secretary of State for International Development and also the Defence Secretary, Penny Mordaunt. And I also sit on the Advisory Council for Conservative Friends for International Development and the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Currently working for Freud's PR, where I work on campaigns which advocate the Sustainable Development Goals. I've been asked to share some of my personal views on the merger just based on my experience as a SPAD, but I'll keep it very short because our other panelists will have, I'm sure, far more interesting and insightful things to say. But I would just say that it's a real opportunity, I think, but one that has to be implemented incredibly carefully and delicately, because DFID has a superb reputation internationally, and getting it wrong could really damage our development offer and also standing in the world, aka soft power. So both departments bring very different skills to the table, I would say. So DFID is very skilled in managing large and complex development programs, but they sometimes lack more traditional diplomatic skills, while the opposite is the case for the Foreign Office. So if done correctly, I think blending the skills of both departments could actually yield something that is greater than just the sum of its parts, which could prove to be a significant boost to UK foreign policy if done correctly. That's a lot of ifs. And while a more coordinated foreign policy promises to give, I think, the Foreign Secretary more clout and also improve international relations, the success of the merger will also depend, I think, on the government's continued commitment to development, whilst also ensuring that there are senior civil servants embedded in the new department. But what's really fascinating about today's panel is that we will be able to hear perspectives from other countries, Canada and also Australia, who have already gone through this merger. So hopefully we'll be able to help inform the important decisions this government is about to make. So we'll start with Harriet. Can I ask you what your thoughts are on the merger, having seen the workings of both departments whilst Minister for Africa?
Thank you so much, Laura, and good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be joining you all in this big tent. And I did have the privilege of being a joint minister. So I was Minister for Africa within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and then within DFID, I was responsible for many of the major programme areas, for example, education, anti-corruption. And I must say that from my point of view, I felt that I could not have done the job in any other way, that doing it jointly just made so much sense. And I think it makes the case very strongly when you actually travel within a country and you see how closely the diplomatic team and the DFID team work on the ground. And I think what we do have to bear in mind throughout this discussion is that we're talking about the very, very poorest in the world. And I think if you're, a baby born in a conflict zone and you rely on UK aid for nutrition, for vaccinations, or if you're a woman who's being trafficked across the Sahel who relies on UK aid to run programs that tackle that, or if indeed you're a girl being educated in any of the very many countries around the world where UK supports education systems, you'll recognise that it's ultimately about what happens with the money and in terms of the focus and the priorities. And within the Foreign Office, with the priorities around human rights, around freedom of religion and belief, around democracy, around the role that we have on the UN Security Council, peacekeeping operations, climate action, you can see that those priorities are very aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And indeed, it was the UK who had very much a leadership role in terms of working towards the global adoption of those 17 key priority areas. And so for me, I think it's going to be an opportunity to amplify those messages for the UK. And I can't really object, having been a joint minister, to the teams working more closely together. But there are three things that I've asked the Foreign Secretary to commit to. And the first is that he will be a very strong voice for the world's poorest in Cabinet. Having that strong voice in Cabinet for the very poorest is incredibly important, and he has committed to doing that. Secondly, I have asked him if he will commit to continuing to spend at least half of the UK's 0.7% aid budget on the poorest and most conflict affected countries, because I think that's where I've seen it make the most significant impact. And he's also committed to that. And the third thing, which is a passion of mine, is to ensure that we continue to spend on education, the campaign for 12 years of education for every child. I think that's how we really accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals and a peaceful, healthier, safer world. And then the final point I would make is, as a parliamentarian and now a backbencher, but I do want to see a separate parliamentary committee that continues to scrutinise how we spend overseas development assistance as a country. Thank you, Laura.
No, thank you, Harriet. We'll now go to the short video message from Nadine in Australia. So that should pop up on our screens now. Here we go.
Good evening, everyone, and greetings from Melbourne, Australia. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight, albeit over video. I will start with why aid. Aid originated from the principles of humanity and solidarity. It is for those less fortunate have the right to receive, and those who are more fortunate have the obligation to provide. It's impartial and it's neutral. So one key question to keep in mind as we proceed is, what is the UK merger trying to solve? Is it efficiency? Now, the Australian experience has shown us that departmental efficiency does not necessarily mean aid efficiency. On the contrary, what we have seen is a decline in the ODA and efficiency being impacted immediately after the merger. Now, there were several reasons for that. One is that there was no prior assessments and consultations done with AusAid. There was a lack of appreciation to the technical expertise AusAid brought in managing aid programs. This has resulted in the loss of talent across AusAid in Australia as well as abroad. There was also an impact on the communication between the government, DFAT, and the Australian civil societies and NGOs. It took years to rebuild and establish trust, rebuild the relationship, and establish a common understanding on aid. We've also seen a preference to bring in the private sector in the aid space, whether it was the Ebola response in 2014 or the Mosul one in 2016. Now, these companies were not subjected to the same accountability measures that otherwise agencies would have been. So if efficiency is the issue, then accountability should be a key action. So recommendation around that could be for UK to establish an external advisory committee to oversee the merger and ensure the objectives are met. Bringing in experts from Australia and Canada can be an option. The second thing I'd like to highlight is the alignment of aid with security and national interest automatically undermines the principles and values of aid. There are two dimensions. Internally, with the foreign policy and security, there are far more players in the space. What we have seen is that DFAT's budget remained the same, and they've recently just gone staffing undercuts, while others have grown quite considerably in budget and staffing. What we've also seen is that with alignment with national interest, livelihood programs in the Middle East are not being implemented by DFAT, but are rather by Home Affairs. On the external dimension, one thing to keep in mind is that when a major power leaves the aid space, it gives the opportunity for another power to move in with their own mechanisms. This is what Australia is grappling with, the rising geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific. With the shift of Australia to the immediate region, it came at the expense of people in need in Africa and the Middle East, and to some lesser extent in Asia and Southeast Asia. What that meant is that Australia has lost its soft diplomacy and influence, for example, on the ASEAN table. Even so, with the focus on the Pacific, the alignment with trade, it meant that it was more focused on infrastructure and less so on the social and economic well-being of vulnerable people. And that too created the opportunity for other powers to move into the Pacific, hence the rising tensions in the region. This is a trend that UK seems to be following, with redirecting the aid to Eastern Europe, with the UK Prime Minister's recent announcement on stepping up support for the Ukraine, and whether that will come at the expense of other regions. So 3 questions I would like to leave you with before I conclude. One is, with the worst pandemic that we're going through right now, we will have the worst food crisis unfolding. How will this department address it, and what will it do differently to ensure that poverty is eradicated and aid is delivered based on needs? The second question is around Yemen. With one arm of the department selling arms into Yemen, what would be the moral compass that this department will use to decide on remedial humanitarian action and reduce the suffering of people in Yemen? And third is the public perception. Aid is part of the UK DNA. It is the birthplace of several world-leading, 100-year-old British institutions, NGOs. What is the message that we're sending to the public around aid efficiency, and is the continuous reform of aid system the answer? Thank you very much. I hope you have a fruitful discussion going forward.
Great. So in case you had a bit of playback delay, we are also circulating the video afterwards, but hopefully it worked for most of you okay. Before I go to John, I also just want to encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat, which we can come to later, so don't forget about that option. But John, thank you so much for joining us from Canada, which is very exciting indeed. Could you share some of the lessons that you think can be drawn from other countries such as Canada who have gone through this merger already?
Well, first of all, thank you, Laura, for this opportunity, and good evening, everyone. It is a peculiar situation to be talking to you from beautiful downtown Haliburton, and everyone can Google beautiful downtown Haliburton. You'll know where I am in Ontario. My message is pretty short and simple. Don't do it. And I go at it from two focus points. One, a private member's bill that I passed or I got royal assent for in 2008. And second of all, the merger in 2013, which basically made CETA, which was our DFATE, sink without a trace. So first of all, when we started the private members bill back in 2006, 2007, there was study after study after study that said Canada's aid was unfocused, it was poorly distributed, it was ineffective, it was a waste of money. And by the way, it wasn't that much money anyways, because we talk a good game in Canada, we actually don't put our money up. So we're at 0.3 and we're hovering. And of course, Great Britain is the gold standard in actual aid distribution, but also the quantum, relatively speaking. So the aid focus was changing like flavor of the month. There was little coordination. You would change from minister to minister, and it seemed like we went through a lot of ministers. They would go from government to government, and of course in 2005 we had a liberal government, and then we had a conservative minority government, and then we had another conservative minority government, then we had a conservative majority government, and then we got a liberal majority government, and now we're into a liberal minority government. So we like governments, and we have over the last quite a number of years, and every one of them has a different focus on what is going to be the distribution profile of the aid. So passed this bill, and the bill was very simple. It first of all said that aid was for poor people. I know that's a strange concept, but you know that is the point. The aid is for poor people. And the second point of the bill was you had to actually ask the poor people what it is they wanted done with the money, not what somebody in Ottawa thought should be done with the money, or wherever particular capital you live in. Thirdly, it had to be consistent with international human rights standards. So those were the 3 points of the bill. And the final point was that 6 months after the fiscal year end, the government had to do a accounting, shall we say, for how they distributed that money. So the people that fought this bill the most were actually the civil servants. You know, God forbid that the discretion of civil servants should be fettered. My goodness, what a concept. So and then of course, that's because the ministers and the governments turn over quite frequently. There's been how should we say, the minister's position has been a junior position for quite a while. I had the bizarre experience of telling one of my own, i.e. the Liberal minister, what was actually in the bill that governed her mandate. She had no idea, absolutely no idea. So, so I guess that's point number one, which is that I don't know whether Britain has a legislated mandate for how the money is to be distributed. The second point is on the merger, and so ours happened in 2013. All of the platitudes that you can think of are actually recited. I was looking at the speeches that the ministers were given, and I had a couple of extractions here. And this is on March 21st, 2013, which, by the way, was my birthday. they said that the linkages between our foreign policy, development, and trade objectives continue to grow as opportunity to leverage each of these grows at equal pace. Well, if your goal of aid is actually helping poor people, well, that may actually not fit into your foreign policy or trade objectives, and maybe even it's contrary to. So, and then the next quote is that it's going to increase Canada's economic opportunities. And then the next quote is, we are going to enhance the alignment and we are going to maximize the effectiveness. All of the bureaucrat speak, all of which is wonderful covering for let's just merge trade, our foreign policy, and our aid, and make it quote unquote aligned. And if it happens to dribble down to poor people, well, that's a bonus. So, you know, if Britain is at the point where it's saying to itself, well, we have to align, we have to merge all of those sometimes contradictory goals for the best interests of Britain, fine, just say so. But don't pretend that it's actually aid in the sense that it's aid for people who actually need the money. So, and then I'll leave you with the final quote, which is one of my favorites. To enhance, and this was the minister at the time, to enhance coordination of international assistance with broader Canadian values and objectives and put development on equal footing with trade and diplomacy. And of course, we will maintain the mandate of poverty alleviation and humanitarian support. Squeeze that in at the end. So I think, frankly, Canada's experience is hypocritical. I think our aid is unfocused. I don't think we put up very much money. If it is at the end of the day just to benefit Canada's foreign policy and trade interests, well, fine, just say that and dump any pretense that this aid is for anything other than for Canada's benefit, as opposed to the incidental benefit for people that I would say many of you are interested in. So with that belling of the cat, I'll sign off and look forward to what others have to say.
Thank you, John. That is very insightful and slightly nerve-wracking.
Oh, I can make it worse.
Amy, what are your primary concerns and hopes for this merger?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for partnering with us today on this event. I think I'm just going to give a bit of background on World Vision UK, first of all, in case the people in the audience don't necessarily know who we are. We are the world's largest international development children's charity, and we're a child-focused Christian relief, development and advocacy organisation. And we are dedicated with working with children, their families and their communities to overcome poverty and injustice. We work in nearly 100 countries, and we have a long history of working with both DFID and the FCO, and we receive funding from both. So we are well placed, I feel, to speak to this issue, and we want to help the government get this merger right. Laura, you're absolutely right. This offers us a unique opportunity, but it must be dealt with well, and it must be dealt with delicately. And I want to just share a few thoughts on why I think it's absolutely vital that the UK gets this merger right. We've already heard that the UK is a leader in aid and development, because every year UK aid saves lives, supports livelihoods and protects the world's most vulnerable children and their communities. I've met South Sudanese refugees and UK aid is helping them build the life skills and the forums that they need to bring peace and reconciliation to their communities. I've heard of 16-year-old Ada in the Central African Republic, and UK aid helped him escape from armed groups and is funding the training and education that he needs to help bring him a brighter future. In 4 years, and these are DFID's own stats, UK aid reached 32.6 million people, which includes at least 10 million women and girls with humanitarian assistance. In that time, it also supported the immunisation of more than 56.4 million children and supported 14.3 million children to gain a decent education. So we should be immensely proud of our development work. as a nation, we have decided to be outward focused and run a department whose entire function is to care for the world's most vulnerable communities. And it's not just a well-intentioned, compassionate response, it's also excellent. It's excellent development work. And so in this merger, the best of DFID and the best of that development work must be brought into the heart of the FCO. And I guess, Laura, if you're asking me what my key concern is, it's that that won't happen. But I think the government can make that happen. And I'd say that there are three key ways in which they can ensure that. The first would be maintaining a poverty focus. The second would be maintaining 0.7%. And the third would be maintaining the high levels of accountability and transparency that DFID currently has. So poverty focus. The purpose of overseas development assistance must always be to alleviate poverty and champion human rights in the world's toughest places. If the UK is to continue to deliver on our international commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Leave No One Behind agenda, then we must have that renewed focus on aid in the FCDO. The coronavirus pandemic threatens to reverse decades of work towards the SDGs, and the UN estimates that 71 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty. So it's even more vital that UK aid reaches those people and that the UK continues to have a focus on the poorest. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have both repeatedly said that UK aid should be spent in the national interest, be that security, diplomatic or trade. And that is very understandable. But UK aid already benefits the UK. It benefits the taxpayer both directly and indirectly. It's a crucial force of the UK's soft power. It contributes to global peace and global prosperity. If there's anything that the coronavirus pandemic has taught us, it's our global interdependence and our shared global security. And UK aid is already leading the fight against coronavirus, and we can't lose that progress. Further, the UK public want UK aid to be spent on reducing poverty before they want it to be spent on the national interest. The Development Engagement Lab ran a survey on what the UK public want to see in the FCDO, and while most people were unaware of the merger, their top priority was transparency and accountability, which I'll come on to later, and the second was a focus on the world's most vulnerable people. That was their second priority. So the British people are proud of UK aid and they're proud of what it does. And we should be very wary of redirecting it for security or trade interests, particularly in middle income countries. And I was very pleased, Harriet, to also hear the Foreign Secretary make that commitment to spending 50% in the conflict-affected and poorest countries. Because redirecting aid might undermine its work. It can further disenfranchise the most vulnerable, lead to increased fragility and instability, and fundamentally undermine its purpose. So in order to prevent this happening, World Vision recommends that the government appoints a minister or a chief secretary for international development who would be responsible for ODA spend and would sit at cabinet with the Prime Minister and on the National Security Council, as the Secretary of State currently does. And that would ensure that the voices of the world's poorest were heard at the highest level, and our continued focus on poverty alleviation. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that the FCDO should also continue to spend ODA in line with the OECD DAC rules, which the UK was foundational in writing, and which currently help ensure that UK aid gets to those who need it most. The second is 0.7%. And I won't spend too much time on this, but just to highlight that we're one of the only countries to meet this target. And it's an achievement of which the UK government should be proud of, and which they have repeated their commitment to maintain, which is absolutely fantastic. We've heard that Canada has seen a gradual erosion of its aid budget, and UK law currently prevents that from happening, and we must continue this and safeguard this commitment. And finally, accountability and transparency. DFID is consistently ranked in the top 10 most transparent ODA funders. It's easy for taxpayers to find out where their money is spent through DFID. Initiatives such as DevTracker mean that you can see what aid projects have been funded where and how the money has been spent, and then the effectiveness and the impact of those projects. DFID has rigorous accountability and scrutiny mechanisms. The International Development Select Committee, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, the Independent Aid Transparency Transparency Index all ensure that DFID's ODA spend is consistently targeted on the world's poorest and is robustly reported on. We don't want to see an erosion of this transparency and accountability. We want to remain a world leader, and so the FCDO should continue these high levels through independent parliamentary scrutiny. So the IDC should be maintained, or a new cross-department parliamentary committee focused specifically on ODA needs to be established. So I think that while the merging of these two departments isn't necessarily a recommendation that World Vision would have made prior to its announcement, we do think the UK has a unique opportunity to learn from Australia and Canada. And again, thank you to our friends and allies across the waters who have come to this event to speak to it for us. And we need to make sure that we do this in a way that Britain's place in the world and the high quality life-saving work of UK aid continues. The Foreign Secretary has repeatedly said this should be a merging of equals and not a DFID takeover by the FCO. And so if we want to continue to see progress in global peace and prosperity, then that must happen. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. So, and thanks to everyone for writing in very interesting comments and questions, which we'll try to get through all of them today. But can I start with giving the floor to David Waddell, who's joining us from BBC News.
Hello, thanks for taking this. It's a question really about the value, the ethical value of linking our foreign policy objectives to aid. I don't know whether that's something that will happen. It's something that certainly could happen. And the question really is, what ethical value is there in linking those two possibilities?
Harriet, do you want to take that one first?
Well, I can have a stab at it, obviously, from the perspective of someone on the backbenches. I think that, and someone who served in both departments, I think that the foundation stones of global Britain and what the UK projects externally is very much one which is founded on the values of democracy, of freedom, of human rights, media freedom, the big media freedom conference we did last year, the importance of hosting COP26, you know, to bring together the world on climate action, you know, all of the things that are embodied in the 17 areas of the Sustainable Development Goals, the propagation of justice around the world, believing that a prosperous, healthier world is a more secure place for our future. I think those are foreign policy objectives, and those are objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think there's a lot of crossover, and it was raised by a couple of the other panelists about the point 7. So I think it might be worth just pointing out that is actually in UK statutes, the point 7. So that's not something that can be changed particularly easily, and it's also something that all three major political parties committed to in their manifestos. So I think we can take the point 7 as a given. That should reassure Nadine on some of the points that she was raising from Australia. And in terms of the ethical underpinnings more generally, you know, what could be more ethical than seeking to achieve a world where people live in freedom, democracy, climate resilience, are well educated, are healthy, prevented from dying from preventable diseases. I mean, I think the whole thing knits together very powerfully if you think of the things that the Foreign Office has been emphasising in the last few years and the things that DFID has been working towards.
Laura?
Yes, John.
If I may, I think it's an excellent question. It's a profound question, and I cannot speak about British experience, obviously, but I go back to the original studies that founded the foundation of the bill. It was the aid was unfocused and it was spread poorly, et cetera, and the interests of a nation are not necessarily the interests of poor people. And I don't think that this particular proposed merger is going to help with that ethical dilemma in the least. I'll give you a little example in Canada. So Canada was recently running for a security seat at the UN, which we lost to Norway and to Ireland. The you know, we frankly ran around the world sprinkling little bits and pieces of aid money all over the place, not because it was particularly useful or it had a particular beneficial, it was particularly beneficial to poor people. Rather, it was in Canada's interest to try and get a seat on the UN. Well, it didn't work. So I don't know. These are the kinds of dilemmas that come up with some frequency, and I would encourage and certainly our friends in the our friends in the UK, you folks have a much more stellar record than do we, but you're going to keep on running into this wall. Is it in UK's best interest for this particular £100 million grant, or is it in the best interest of those that are supposed to receive it? So I just throw that out.
Thank you. Amy, did you want to say anything on that, or should I go to the next question?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'm afraid I'm going to do that really irritating thing, David, of saying that I think your question might be the wrong way round, and suggest that there might be value in ethical value in tying our foreign policy objectives to our aid and development agenda. I mean, the FCO already leads on some fantastic initiatives, such as preventing sexual violence in conflict, and so we can't, you know, separate those two things. But I think that holistic vision, ensuring that our foreign policy and our development policy are both benefiting the world's most vulnerable children, and, you know, looking at the do no harm principle as a groundstone for everything that we do abroad might be helpful.
Great.
Thank you.
One of the questions we had also pre-submitted is from Sarah Johns, who's a transparency manager at Bond. And she wants to know how, you know, learning from the experience of other governments, so John, this one's incoming to you, what has been the impact of the merger on transparency and accountability of aid allocation and expenditure?
It was not very transparent to begin with, and it's only got worse, would be my quick reaction. The folks at CETA, when the bill first passed, struggled mightily to try and accommodate to the transparency and accountability requirements of the bill. And I, you know, I would like to think that they tried hard, but it was still pretty hard to discern whether the money was actually going to those who needed it. And then with the merger, what was previously a struggle became a Herculean task, and disaggregating the aid in any kind of a transparent, accountable fashion has been a challenge, shall we say.
Harriet, do you have any concerns in this regard?
Well, I do want to see the continued transparency of government spending in all departments. I think, you know, pretty much across the board, I've been a minister in defence and in Treasury as well. We've always been very transparent about publishing pretty much everything over £500. So I think we'd want to see that. I think related to some of the points that John's been making, I think one of the great strengths of DFID has been its ability to evaluate how well projects worked and to set aside from every budget something to evaluate how successful it was, and that constant process of learning what works and what doesn't work in a very what's the word, a very impartial way, saying actually no, we've done that before, that didn't work, we've evaluated this approach, that didn't work. I found that was a very rigorous internal mechanism that also helped the department get better and better in terms of impact.
Mm. Yeah, I would also agree that from an international reputational perspective, that is one of the things that DFID is so well respected for, and I think if that doesn't get maintained, that could severely damage our overall reputation abroad across foreign policy. Another question I'd quite like to ask, and Kamini Paul is on the call. She's the head of institutional partnerships from the Thomas Reuters Foundation. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think you indicated previously you'd like the chair to ask the question, so the one you just put in the chat I think is quite an interesting one. Are you, unless you speak now, I'm going to ask the question.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
All right, okay.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us anyway. So how will the
Yeah.
FCDO manage the nexus between traditional stabilization policies and more traditional development cooperation programming? We have seen this approach in fragile and conflict-assisted states, countries in particular, leading to short-termism rather than sustainable interventions. Who would like to take that first? Should I just, this is the power of a chair. Do I just appoint someone? Amy, do you want to go first?
Sorry, yes, absolutely. I guess short-termism is always a danger, and one of World Vision's constant advocacy calls is for long-term flexible funding. And I think that is that's a difficulty with establishing your budgets every year. And I think this new department offers us a new opportunity to increase that flexibility in funding, and to bring sort of innovative funding mechanisms, things like the START network, for example, that's sort of well renowned for being quick and on the ground, and bringing those things in. What does development look like in a new way, and what can we do differently? We don't have to just pilot the same programs again and again. We can look at what DFID did well and what models DFID wanted to use more of, and bring them further into this new department. If it truly is a new department, then we have that opportunity afforded to us.
Shall I add something to that, Laura? Yes. Which is that I think the framework for the Sustainable Development Goals that the UK and every other country in the world has signed up to is not going to go away. That's a framework where we're in the decade of action. So I think that's got to be an overarching framework for making progress against those goals. Certainly DFID is the only department that I think I've ever served in where ultimately the goal is to end poverty and effectively to ensure that it's not needed. Now, I think we're all realistic to know that that's probably not going to happen in our working lifetimes, but I think that it does have a very long-term frame of reference by definition. Doesn't necessarily mean that programs have to be contracted to the same contractor for a long period of time, but certainly it means that the direction of travel is over an extended period of time.
Thank you. The chat has already asked everyone, but just to draw your attention to it, we'd love to hear everyone's thoughts through the chat as to what your biggest worry and recommendation is in regards to this merger. So if you have views on your biggest worry and recommendation, please share it in the chat. You can do it privately or to everyone, but we would love to know. The other interesting question that came through was talking about, and it's kind of alluded to earlier, but through Nadine and her video, saying when some people, certain countries start spending less or retract in certain areas, other countries will most likely come in and take their place and role. Ewan Grant, who's a senior consultant at Grant and Gutzel Consultants, would love to know from Harriet, as your experience as Minister for Africa, and also, I guess, due to your previous role as trade envoy to Russia, how you feel, the impact that Russia and China will have and are having in developing countries, especially in Africa and the Middle East.
Great, thanks, Laura. Yes, I was very, very briefly appointed to that role, and then the Crimea happened, and so that didn't last long. But you're absolutely right to point out that we are not, we are one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and of course, key UK foreign policy objective is to try and influence the wider Security Council in the direction of the travel that we want to see towards greater human rights, democracy, freedom, media freedom, etc., etc. And we also, and this allows me to bring in the fact that overarching both the Foreign Office and DFID is, of course, the National Security Council, and that the Prime Minister chairs that. And that looks at the wider perspective in terms of what's going on in the wider world, and will therefore be able to put into the overall context what we're seeing in terms of developments in the wider world. So in my time as Minister for Africa, we were guided very much by an internal NSC-led process that we described as the Africa strategy, that is part of ensuring that UK influence and the values that the UK stands for in its foreign policy are the ones which resonate most, and that can be implemented in a wide range of different ways, and looking at time horizons over the long term. So yes, there is obviously behind this whole merger, probably worth highlighting the fact that there is that overall NSC chaired by the Prime Minister that does look strategically at the overall work of Her Majesty's government in all those different ways.
Great. I'd love to bring in Tim Morris now, because there's been a few comments actually in the chat asking whether this will mean that there will be more ambassadors with previous international development experience. And Tim, who I happen to know, is a former ambassador and has international development experience and has a question. So I think we'd love to hear from you, Tim.
So much, and it's great to follow my former boss, Harriet. I was British ambassador in South Sudan and in DRC, and was a vital coordinator on the Sahel. And I have been spending some time defending the DFID work stream, the 0.7, and a lot of messages in tune with what people have said. But I think there's something which needs to be said about the wider foreign policy picture. There's a risk in all these debates of caricaturing different departments, which after all, in the end, are buildings. They're not people. People move around. Lots of former DFID people are now ambassadors and high commissioners in Africa, for example. And we're waiting an overall review of the UK's international strategy, which is surely the most critical element, which will determine both how this departmental reorganisation works, and indeed how trade and defence, which are essential parts of our overseas projection, are brought into that discussion. I mean, it's worth pointing out too that trade has a very profound role in the elimination of poverty. So there is a risk, I think, in this debate of actually getting away from some of the core overseas policy questions which need to be actually led by our elected politicians. I think there's something about this debate where there's a sort of assumption that separate departments have their own sort of beating hearts and they're all fighting against each other. Now, you know, there's an element of that. But what officials are waiting for is leadership from elected politicians. And this review, if it works and it actually gets stuck in properly to the issues, will be profoundly important. But just to say at the end, I mean, I very much agree with Harriet's opening statement about this, that there's a huge exaggeration about the degree to which departments and the different sort of tribes in Whitehall are somehow working against each other. I mean, I was a DFID ambassador, and I proudly used to say that when I went into my office when I arrived in Congo or South Sudan. DFID objectives and work programs were actually a fundamental part of our foreign policy objectives in those countries. Girls' education, humanitarian activities, these things are policy-rich statements of what this country is about. I find it difficult to believe that our political leaders will actually go far away from that. Though, of course, it's quite right, as people have been alerting us to, that there are a whole series of issues to be potentially concerned about. I was actually, I said something in public, which perhaps I shouldn't have, but about concern about the loss of the Secretary of State position, Secretary of State DFID position. That seemed to me the single greatest loss of any future reorganisation. There was a comment made before the reorganisation was announced. But I would very much like to ask Harriet about the review and what her interpretation is.
Thank you, Tim.
Oh, lovely to see you as well, Tim, and bringing back happy memories. And I'm obviously not probably as close as you are now to what's going on in terms of the review, but I'm quite sure that it will continue to embody, as part of the review, the UK having signed up to a wide range of international commitments as well as our own statutory commitments, and therefore perhaps I am less worried than I'm hearing from some people in the audience and from Nadine's opening remarks about the shift that might result in. So, to give you an example of the kind of thing where I think the review, I hope, will say, this is a good thing, is the approach that we have been taking to a country let's take, but it's perhaps not fair to pick a particular country. Let's pick a whole area, a vast area, the Sahel. And think about, it's an area well, Tim, the fact that there is the world's most dangerous peacekeeping operation happening there, and that the UK has announced that we will be providing UN peacekeepers to that, and that one of the legacies of the 2015 Security and Defence Review was that the UK wanted to step up its role, its peacekeeping role. I think it's been widely agreed that the UK contribution to the South Sudan peacekeeping force has been incredibly impactful. And so I personally think it's exactly aligned with all of these different elements of our international commitments that we should be doing this to the peacekeeping operation based in Mali. So I think that's the sort of thing I would hope to see being emphasised in the review. If that was something that were going to be downplayed or downgraded, I would be voicing extreme concerns from the backbenchers. But for what I know, I would have thought that that was very much a direction of travel. Secondly, that there will be an enormous focus on making COP26 a success. Now, as anyone who has travelled widely in the poorest countries in the world, they will see that they are the ones who are suffering most from climate change and from the degradation of the environment. And so I would hope that, again, there will be a big focus on our international climate commitments and making sure that that's spent in those very, very climate degraded and climate affected parts of the world. One of my passions when I was privileged to be a DFID minister was all the poor women who were spending hours every day traipsing to cut down prime forests and cook over that in their homes, and choking themselves and their families and causing major health problems as a result. This is a single issue that really encapsulated all the things that we would try to change. So I hope that it will be emphasising that, the importance of the climate side of things, the importance of to the UK of making sure that we deal with conflict affected areas, because it's in everyone's interest to secure a better future for our children that we tackle that.
Thank you, Harriet. There seems to be a couple of trends going on from participants at the moment, and one of them is a real concern about redirecting expenditure away from poverty is what is likely to happen, and instead that it will go to supporting the UK's broader diplomatic and national interests. So I feel like that is that is a wide concern. The other thing that...
Can I make a quick point on that, Laura? So it's worth pointing out that when I was DFID Minister, I did increase the amount that we were spending in Ukraine and in the Balkans as well. So it's to me, it's not an either or, it's an and.
Yeah, good point. And I think the other concern, which I do share, is sort of a loss of a voice from a Secretary of State at the cabinet table, but in particular the National Security Council. And I'd like to actually bring in Andrew Morley, who is the president of World Vision International, who has a question along these lines, unless, Andrew, you'd like me to ask it for you. But I'd love to hear from you. Okay, I'm going to go and ask it for you, Andrew. So you asked in the chat that currently the voices of the world's most vulnerable are heard at the highest level of government, ensuring that development concerns are heard at cabinet level. This is somewhat unique in the UK. Can it be maintained when the Secretary of State position has been dissolved? I mean, John, it'd be great to get an insight as to Canada and your experience there. And also, can I just plug that I believe we should have a Deputy Foreign Secretary, if not a Chief Secretary to International Development in the Foreign Office. I hope that will be reality. But John, what's your view on a lack of that senior voice, that a voice at a senior level in government?
Well, the seat of minister was always the junior minister in the triumvirate. So the foreign minister was the premier minister, the trade minister was not too far behind, and the seat of minister was, generally speaking, a junior minister without actually saying so. At this point, with the merger, the foreign affairs minister is the one that calls the shots for the entire department, and he has his priorities, and those priorities are not necessarily the priorities of CETA. And so I've just been listening to the conversation back and forth here, and Great Britain has a commendable record. I mean, it's quite a commendable record. It's something that of which you are quite justifiably proud. But my overall reaction is that with the loss of a what do you call it, a secretary position, that's just the tip of the iceberg. That ultimately the merger of foreign policy interests and trade interests and aid interests will overwhelm aid interests, and so. I hope your experience is better than ours. Is all I can say, and maybe because you do have such a commendable record and you have such strong people, it will be different than ours. But it seems to me that you're building into your entire system policy incoherence, and policy incoherence will necessarily lead to power changes. Power changes, well, I don't think will ever work to the benefit of aid.
Thank you, John. I am conscious of time, and of course there is the opportunity to stay for an informal chat, which we do recommend you all do. And there was one question from Mark Barnes-Ricketts, which I thought would be quite nice to get to, but maybe we can do that in the next bit, which is just save it for a couple of minutes, but just to see, how this merger will affect the UK's influence and impact on the world stage, considering we've got G7 presidency and also, as Harriet mentioned, COP26 hosting that next year. I also just found out that being a Big Tent friend and having access to all the digital events is now only £6 a month because it's digital. I definitely paid more than that, so I think that's a bargain. So you should definitely, I encourage you all to do that. And I'm also just going to take the opportunity to shamelessly announce that there is going to be a Big Tent podcast launching in 2 weeks, which I'm hosting. So I'm very excited about this. I'll be speaking to politicians and business people and opinion formers, calling about what were you thinking. So please keep your eyes peeled, and when you see it, obviously subscribe, please. And of course, give Big Tent a follow on Twitter. But now I think we're 1 minute to half past. I think that is a big win. we will now stop recording, and for people who would like to stay, please do, and we can have a more informal discussion about this topic. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you.